The West London Orbital is a proposed new underground line to serve West London. It results from research commissioned by West London Business. At present, nearly all the rail lines in West London run in an east-west direction. This is fine if you want to commute to central London, but it can be very difficult to make journeys in a north-south direction by public transport. The proposal is to build a new orbital underground line to connect together 20 existing radial lines. A number of routes have been looked at. The most promising option would run between Brent Cross and Surbiton via Ealing Broadway.
The West London Orbital would operate using short driverless trains similar to the Docklands Light Railway, but updated to the most modern standards. You can see such a system if you look at the recently opened Copenhagen Metro in Denmark. Every station on the route would be within 15 minutes of the interchange with Crossrail at Ealing Broadway. So how has this proposal come about? West London is one of the UK's key economic generators. Strategically located between Heathrow Airport and central London, it is an employment centre of international significance. This success has largely been based on road transport.
This plan shows the home locations of a major West London employer. Just over half these employees live within 15 kilometres of their workplace. For most of them, driving is the only practical way to get to work. At the moment, about 2/3 of journeys to West London jobs are by car. Traffic congestion is a major and growing concern in West London. The main planning tool used to control traffic growth over the last decade has been to drastically reduce the amount of car parking permitted for new development, so that only about 1 in 20 people drive to work. This is now seriously affecting the provision of new jobs in West London and is causing real difficulties for existing businesses that want to expand. Although static businesses can keep going as long as they are, the West London economy is stagnating at the level it reached in the late 1990s. Local buses and cycling cater for shorter journeys, but speeds are low and the opportunities for improvements, such as further bus lanes, are few. Street-running rail solutions, like the now abandoned West London tram, can cause more problems than they solve.
Present proposals for rail improvements in West London are limited to Crossrail and the rebranding of the North London line as the London Overground. Crossrail will have a major benefit in reducing overcrowding on existing trips to central London, but will have little or no benefit in improving accessibility within West London. The London Overground has few linkages with the radial lines it intersects, and it would be very difficult, expensive and disruptive to provide the necessary interchanges. As a result, West London is increasingly becoming a dormitory for commuters to central London. But the costs of providing and upgrading rail links to central London are increasing rapidly, as has happened with Crossrail.
Most West London homes and jobs are within reasonable reach of a railway station, or could be made so at a modest cost by further improvements to local buses and cycle facilities. The solution proposed is to link together the many radial lines in West London so that they act together as a single cohesive system, rather than a series of independent lines. Now, a bit about engineering and costs. Compared with building a metro line in inner London, constructing an entirely new West London orbital should be relatively uncomplicated. The subsoil strata are suitable for modern tunnel boring machines. There are few other tunnels to avoid, and the tunnel diameter would be smaller than for a heavy rail scheme.
Because the trains would run frequently, with 3-minute intervals at busy times, the stations can be relatively small and thus cause minimal disruption at street level. The station boxes would typically have a plan area of 20 metres by 60 metres. That's about one bendy bus length wide by 3 bendy buses long. They would be built downwards from ground level using the same construction methods that are used for buildings that have basements. Based on experience in Copenhagen, platforms would typically be 18 metres below street level. Capita Simon's cost estimate for building the scheme is £1.75 billion. This figure includes rolling stock, escape shafts, maintenance depot, track and signalling. It assumes that the geology is as predicted, and it doesn't include the cost of extending the Oyster card system, which would be sensible anyway. The cost of land would probably be more than covered by development rights at stations.
The cost figure is broadly compatible with the cost of the recently completed Copenhagen Metro, which cost £1.1 billion, with just over half the 21-kilometre route being tunnelled. The proposed West London Orbital would make travel by public transport a real option for many journeys that at present can only sensibly be undertaken by car. Destinations such as Heathrow and Wembley Stadium would become accessible from anywhere in West London without the need to travel via central London or by car. West London's public transport system would become a cohesive network rather than a series of parallel radial routes leading to central London. Journey times would be more reliable and predictable. The new metro would fit well with plans for Crossrail. It would also include a new interchange station with Thameslink near Staples Corner, where major redevelopment is already planned. Where next? This West London Orbital proposal is the outcome of a feasibility study carried out for West London Business to identify how a step change in strategic public transport accessibility can be achieved in West London.
The study has confirmed that the key structural weakness in the transport system is the lack of an orbital public transport route that has interchanges with the many radial railway and tube lines. A project of this kind will need public sector support from borough councils, the Mayor of London, and eventually from central government. Funding sources will need to be identified. These could include income from road pricing schemes that seem likely to be introduced over the next decade, and the increasing tax revenue arising from escalating oil prices.
West London Business will be asking Transport for London to undertake a more detailed study to identify more firmly the costs, benefits and environmental effects, including land requirements. A scheme of this magnitude is likely to take a decade or so in preparation. But preparatory works needn't take so long as, for example, Crossrail. The concept is simple, and the scheme is not dependent on reallocating existing track for parts of the route. An entirely new line should be easier to build than renovating crumbling Victorian infrastructure, as can be seen from the recently completed high-speed line to St Pancras. Now, if you'd like to learn more, copies of both the summary report and the full report can be downloaded from this website.